There she stood. Her nude body was between an abstract series of colors. She was obscured, certainly, but it was her. For moments at a time, her figure blurred until it resembled a splotch, matching the multicolored haze that fell behind her. But then, only moments later, she became clear, the blurring fading away. I stared at her, my eyes poring over this frail woman. She was deathly skinny, a series of bones protruding from just below her skin. However, a few seconds later, the great blur returned, as if she was caught in the motion of a constant pendulum, in which her form emerged from the blur and then succumbed to it again, over and over. The soles of my feet were pressing against a cold and undefinable material composing the ground. But when I looked down, there wasn't one. It was just thin air, holding me up as if there were an invisible floor. When I went to move my feet, not a single muscle budged, as though they were encased in some thick amber. But this sight was familiar, even if it confused me, every time. I've stood in this exact spot before, staring at the figures just beyond me in this place, that glass pane standing between us, blocking our touch. I looked back towards her. Her palms were placed over her eyes, hiding them from me. Long, blonde hair, almost white, fell from her scalp to her elbows, from both in front and behind her. Behind her pressing palms, I noticed freckles lining aimlessly across her cheeks. Surrounding us were the edges of a bubble, where anything past its ends was shrouded in complete darkness. A light emerged from somewhere in the place we were standing, as we could see each other and the multicolored haze caught by its emission. But its origin was hard to place. And as she moved, her frail body changing its stance, no shadow was attached. And when I looked down, none was to me either. Just those battered, half-held boots, with no black reflection hanging along its edges. This was typical, this shadowless state, but it surprised me every time. I glanced back towards that standing figure, her palms still pushing against her eye sockets. There was nothing but silence here, a strange ambiance emitting from the haze, sure, but nothing particularly audible. Nothing comprehensible. I thought back to all the times I stood in this exact moment, the figures standing in front of me, their shadowless beings behind the blurring and then unblurring pane. When my lips would be caught adrift, or perhaps pursing as to emit a more specific sound, nothing would happen. But then I thought back to the client's instructions. So I tried to speak. My lips opened, my throat muscles contracting as I readied myself. But when the lips pressed against each other, the sound emitting from within was stifled by a constriction felt between the insides of my cheeks. The more I opened them, a great tug forced my mouth to close again. That was the caveat to this place, this world of the dead. The dead can't speak, not in their final moments. They never would. Their bodies sometimes motioned a sense of language, but it was hard to pinpoint between their frantic shakes from the frigid air. And in this fact of no communication, little more went to her, besides something reminiscent of an aimless baby peering through a crib. But then her palms started to move, their press turning into a hover. Eventually, they dropped, revealing the entirety of her face, but not before the blur pulled her back into a state of obscurity. My hand, instead, took charge. It extended my arm at a perfect 90-degree angle until my palm met the cold glass that stood between the woman's figure and mine. The same glass that blurred us. The same glass between worlds. The same one I'd seen 1,000,000 times over. On the other side, from that constantly blurring and then unblurring figure, an arm met mine, its palm placed in the exact same position on the other side of the glass pane. The sweat that dripped from her hands smudged against the veil, and from the little I could make out, her head became cocked to the side, as if she was musing at my forward-looking palm. I recognized that muse from somewhere before, from the photo given to aid my search. It was undeniably her, the woman I was looking for. The blurring trickled away yet again, the aspects of her physical being becoming clearer by the moment, and then, shortly after, blurring again. But when I finally caught wind of the clearest I could get her, I noticed something odd. Was it the hair? I thought back to the picture of that woman in the field who was tending to those crops, the same photo given to me by her mourning husband. In the picture, she was blonde, its soft shine emitting from the glistening sun. But here, her hair was more a shade of white, as if the color was leaving it entirely, and each follicle was ignited by a relentless, multi-sourced array of color. Was it the paleness of her skin? I must have forgotten the rules of this realm. The paleness ran through all of the dead, a unifying characteristic that weaves through all that I see here, all who I find for my clients, the figures standing amidst the great nothing. What about the necklaces? They weren't like anything I'd seen before. Their metal seemed so beautifully fashioned, as though carefully articulated and designed with the wearer in mind. A glisten emerged from them several colors wide, and it looked as though 6 dangled from her neck. And then it hit me. Her blue eyes were missing, and I don't just mean the color of the iris, no. There were no eyes. No pale blue as the shivering husband promised me. He whose hand was just as covered in sweat, smudging across the photo of her. He whose body quivered at the thought of his dead wife, at the thought of being able to see her again through me. He whose family would be in shambles. He whom I didn't care about. She kept her left hand the way that it was, meeting with mine, but as she did so, she moved the one to her right, sliding it across the surface of her skin until it met her stomach. She started to pat it as a tear rolled down her cheek, causing her face to wince. How could the eyeless cry? I thought. Her head was cocked beneath her shoulders now, an eyeless gaze toward the pat. 2 gigantic holes burrowed into her head. Who did this to her? As this thought crossed my mind, then came that feeling again. Everything there in front of me. The woman I was meant to find for the husband's sake. The haze which glistened in multicolored fashion. And just the thought of being here before. It all came back at once. I'd had it before, many times over. Moments where I was poised in the kitchen, staring over a bag of food laid across the table. Or perhaps a new restaurant downtown that just opened, yet I'd sworn I'd sat in that exact seat, staring at that exact waitress. But here, for the first time, I'd been experiencing it right in front of the dead. An alarm went off in my head, signaling a pattern of that being here before. But I hadn't been here before. In fact, aside from the paleness and the nudity, there was nothing normal about this entire encounter. The dead would normally look at me, their color-stricken eyes quivering at the sight. I would usher a few motions, attempting to establish contact, and afterwards they would soon disappear. That was the end. But here, it was different. Here was like nothing I'd seen before. Here, where the eyeless woman stared. If so, why was an alarm going off, telling me you've already been here? What was the purpose? And as these questions rang in my mind, I began to smell what seemed like a burnt rubber. Then, her head glanced back towards me, her hand continuing to pat her stomach. It was then that I knew what she meant to say. I got what I wanted, what her husband was looking for. My hand's press against the glass lessened, the cold of the pain disappearing. I saw my own hand come towards me, but then I felt a snatch. Her hand reached over towards mine, clasping my wrist in cold temperature. Its shake extended to mine, and the sweat hadn't eased. The glass veil that stood between us was still there, but was ignored by her. She was moving past it as though it was invisible, as though it hadn't even mattered anymore. The darkness that surrounded our bubble started to encroach upon us, moving closer and closer to her figure and mine. It slowly engulfed it mere inches at a time, causing the light to fade. I looked back towards her. Each tear trickled down her face, hanging on the chin before falling. I noticed one tear in particular, tracking its descent. I saw it let go of her skin, dangle within the air, and then collapse to that transparent floor. In a matter of a few seconds, another tear replaced it, and then another, and another. I looked down and saw the small beginnings of a puddle. The holes that burrowed into her head did not let off her spouts of water. After a moment, an edge of the puddle touched one of my toes. Then, after only a second later, it seeped to the back of my heel. The puddle was starting to move around my feet and into whatever was behind me. As this process occurred, I glanced back at her figure. She was paler now, even skinnier than how she was when I first saw her only moments ago. Her revealed bones grew more apparent, while her skin became a shade of an almost intolerable white. Elsewhere, along her throat, the chain that bound her intricate necklace snapped, causing its entire metal body, including the colors that hung from it, to fall into the puddle. She cocked her head to the side again, those two holes musing at me with much focus despite the absence of eyeballs. Could she still see me? My brain pulsated with confusion and surprise, its individual parts working in overdrive to discover any logic in what was happening to no avail. Meanwhile, I started to feel a jolt from above my right ear, a feeling of writhing skin. With only her arm reaching past the veil, she walked towards me, her entire form eventually as clear as could be. The veil disappeared behind her, dissipating in the airs as if it was evaporating, as if her touch in walking through it caused its disintegration. Her pale hand continued to pat her stomach. Over and over it went. She kept signaling. She wanted me to know. She wanted to make sure that I knew. I looked at it and nodded, but she kept patting. The palm that continuously met the surface of her skin shook uncontrollably. Its own tears, the sweat, coming out in droves and running down her stomach. The edges of her body began a frivolous shake. Just as it began this process, her head slowly descended, as if the weight of it grew several pounds. I expected her kneecaps to swing forward in an act of catching her falling body, but that expectation was shattered. She collapsed to the ground in her own tearful puddle, the side of her face colliding with the body of water. With her body laying sideways into the liquid, I stood, frozen. The woman's tears continued to flow, but they were a sideways stream now, adding to the puddle. And that's when I felt it. The heat. A plume of smoke became illuminated. It rose from the liquid that enveloped both of us. I saw it on her, the burn. The side of her face started to turn red, and before I knew it, a brown. Her flesh was being burned. Was this happening to me? I looked down. My boots were still there, but the edges were slowly dropping. The material that created its shape became malformed, and a hole started to form at the heel. Water seeped in, causing me to feel the scorching heat. But as I stood there, staring at it with winced eyes and an ugly grimace of pain, I'd realized that there was no pain. For some reason, I was completely immune. She opened her mouth for the first time, gasping for air as it narrowly avoided the rising water. There was something strange about it. As her lips drifted apart and her entire body flexed, I saw a faint glint emerge from her mouth. It was an entanglement of strings. They were crisscrossed between the insides of her cheeks, weaving in and out of each other to form what looked like some sort of net. The more she gasped for air, I could see its restriction. But she grew tired of it, I think, as she raised a finger and tugged on it. Unfortunately, it was to no avail. She pulled once, and there was nothing. 3 times, and there was nothing. But when she did it for the 6th time, it snapped, its parts drifting away aimlessly or into the collided puddle. With her lips finally free, she spoke.
I tried to keep them away from him.
She managed. She pointed towards my legs, my ankles now submerged in the still rising water.
That's how they want it. That's how.
My brain pounded against my head, begging for meaning. Theories floating in and out, subconscious methods to piece together what I was seeing. But they were, yet again, met with only silence, with nothing.
The lust.
She started to choke, spitting out water upon the puddle. However, the more water she spat out, the more water seeped back in. As the puddle continued its ascendance, there was no stopping it from entering every hole that was in her body, including through the eyes. Her neck started to strain, its veins poking as she quivered back and forth. She kept trying to move it, to face behind her, but it kept falling forwards. I knelt down, my hand extending to meet that soft bit of her head that was untouched by the burning water, as to help her, but she swatted it away.
Don't you see them?
I shook my head.
They've been watching you for so long. They took them from me. My eyes.
Tears continued to trail down from her holes. What did they do to her?
But I have them back. The true ones. The true ones, not those spheres.
A distant flicker emerged beyond our bubble. It shone beautifully, its lights rotating as if it was some sort of lighthouse. It came from the darkness outside of our light's edges, the only other light source in view besides our mysterious, bubbly own. Its colors matched what was around me, the rainbowed fog, but the intensity was unparalleled, like a bright light traveled through it into our, or my, eyes.
But I've lost more than that.
She continued, spitting out more water as it invaded her esophagus. With the energy left in her, she laid her quaking hand across her stomach once more. She tried to pat it, but could only lay it there.
I've given them away. I've given both away. It was the only way, I swear it. I tried to stop them, bring them with me instead.
She rose that same hand, extending towards me as droplets of liquid ran down its sides. The hand, too, was characterized by a crimson shade. It was just like the redness that went into her before she started to burn, before her flesh became crinkled and brown like a wetted paper bag left along the edges of a road.
They found another way to bridge themselves between. I helped them. I helped them create it. I didn't mean to. I didn't want him to be like that.
She laid her head back upon the water, her neck still straining to keep at least her mouth afloat. After a moment, she turned toward that distant light. When she did, it shone even brighter, as if responding to her, as if it knew she was looking at it.
But this is more beautiful than what they could ever do, or see, or feel.
Her voice dropped, but not because of the water. She stopped herself from speaking, and then moved her head toward me.
How long have you done this?
She asked.
How long?
The shift in her voice disturbed me. Something in her had changed, like she'd realized something.
How long? Have you seen that?
The water invaded her lungs now. She began to cough, twisting her head in great strength to face the sky. But as the light shone directly upon her withering face, emphasizing the white shade that overpowered it and the burn marks enveloping it, her lips started to curve a smile. She turned her eyeless head toward me, and then the smile opened, and that's when I heard it emerge from within her. The sound of nothing. The ambiance that surrounded us was silenced. In its place, not a single noise. No soft murmurs, not even a whisper. It was truly nothing. In this time, her smile grew larger. I didn't think it was possible for this place to become any quieter. The gust of wind that flew through us, the soft sounds emitting from afar. They were little to begin with, but this was different. This was even absent of that. But there was something about it, something about the way this nothing truly was. Something about the way that it was. Then the water became my own. Beads of sweat trickled down my forehead, crashing into the pillow at a quick pace. My eyes opened from within the bed frame, the woman and the myriad of surrounding colors disappearing in an instant. There she went. In their places, the rough texture of the roof. In its middle was that rapidly rotating ceiling fan, the blades spinning as the air pressed against my sweat-infused skin, casting a dim and then undimmed light, despite me not turning it on. This would seldom happen, but enough that I should have fixed it by then. I glanced over to my open palm. That woman's picture, which I was holding in my hand before the rude awakening, was missing. I jolted up upon the mattress, pausing for a moment to address a lightheadedness. The vision of my room started to swirl, becoming some unfathomable whirlpool right in front of me. But after a moment, its shape returned to normal, and I saw a glimmer from just beyond the edge of the bed. I pushed myself over the mattress to orient my gaze to this glisten, and saw her framed photo laying in the midst of glass shards. The glass burrowed itself into the carpet like ticks, but also over her indented face. One of the photo's corners began to fold over, the wind of the ceiling fan further pushing it. Written on it were penciled words saying, "Her name is Cerila." Around the "is" was a soft, half-erased "was."
Cerila.
Voice called from my memory. It was a deep, masculine voice I would ascribe confidence to. But I knew the truth. While in my room, I remembered him. The look of the sound. Paul O'Bellum.
A seizure.
His shaken voice told me in this memory. Paul's face tried desperately to be still, its muscles crinkling in defiance of the oncoming tsunami to fall from his eyes. Paul always seemed like he was holding something in, whether it was tears or pleas itching to let themselves loose. Sometimes, they would.
It was instant. We hadn't any time to react.
He put his cup down without taking a sip, his voice breaking.
I remember seeing her face. The way those eyes were.
In a local coffee shop, I watched the hunched-over man in front of me spout words of sorrow from across the table.
When she hit the floor, she was gone. It was over as soon as it happened. No fucking way. No fucking way for me to react. She was the one. I don't know if I can afford going without.
I wanted to scream. Without her? But I kept my mouth closed. And sure enough,
I don't know if I can afford going without her.
I rolled my eyes, glancing towards him to see if he noticed. He was too busy staring at the texture of the laminated granite tabletop to spot that. He had one of his fingers drawing across it like he was seeing something I wasn't. But when I looked down, there was nothing there. The job takes a toll upon you. Shortly, clients seem like they are behaving on scripts, weaving in and out with their own personal objectives. That's what Paul was. A client. Not a special exception to this dull, repetitive process. A client. But at least he, among others, would keep the lights on.
Do you consider it a gift?
He asked, his droopy eyes clearly struggling to meet mine. I was silent. He nodded.
I thought so.
Back in the bedroom, I sighed, wondering how I would explain the state of the picture to him. Edges were torn, a scratch growing across her photoed face. Perhaps I can just hide it, I thought. Perhaps he won't ask. I went to pick it up, my hand descending upon the photo of the woman. As my shadow drew nearer, her photo was clear. She was bending over to take care of a sapling in the midst of a field. 4 figures watched from behind her, all running towards that beautiful-looking woman. 3 were children, all girls, but the 4th was an adult. That was the client. When I first received this picture from Paul, his shaking hand extending to mine, I noted the way he looked in it. His eyes, though afar, more expressive and precise. But I kept staring at it, this claustrophobic feeling of déjà vu rising within me, as it always would. It wasn't the picture, no. Not the woman of the field. No, it was something about the eclipse I cast upon it. That shadow. As I stared, I began to feel a slight pinch in the bottom of my foot. My eyes kept staring at the shadow, at the eclipse, but then the pinch grew more apparent, extending. I raised my leg and twisted the foot in question. A shard of glass was nestled into it, with only a slight edge poking from my skin. My nerves became overloaded, blood dripping from the wound. I started to fall, but I would land further into the glass. Instead, I pushed myself away from the broken shards and landed in a clear spot on the carpet in one great thud. As my grip increased its pressure upon the foot, ridding it of any color, I drew my index and thumb. I slowly moved them through the air, into that exposed edge, until they'd met it. In one great pull, the whole of the glass was revealed to me. It was stained with blood, running off its multiple edges, and quite large, but now it was removed. Then, a knock pounding from downstairs. I pushed myself up, sitting upon the carpet. For a moment, a part of me wondered who it was, but then I'd remembered the shivering man who had come here every morning, and I was surprised I'd almost forgotten. Soon after reaching the last step of my staircase, I peered through the door's peephole. I saw the man with his scraggly, unkempt beard and stained London University t-shirt. On the porch, he looked down with his hands in his pockets. Snow particles were glistening upon his thin, unzipped jacket. I unlocked it, opening it to his surprise.
You're up early. Bad dream?
He asked, biting his lip. If it weren't for the clothes on his back, I would never have recognized him. I've never been particularly good at facial recognition, especially with so many clients coming in and out and in and out. Behind Paul were an assortment of houses aligned across the block. I lived in a neighborhood, a great collection of nosy neighbors who I'd never associated with. Like me, they seldom left their homes, only going in and out to fetch groceries. As of right now, in this cold, wintry afternoon, the snow was restless, only letting off for a little while. But yet, somehow, Paul made his way here, perhaps waiting until those soft bits of snow quit patterning from the sky, and then met me immediately. A man stood at the driveway of such a neighboring house, not even trying to disguise his curiosity. He was like the other neighbors, but instead of peering between blinds, he was being as upfront as possible. His eyes drifted over Paul and I, standing upon the porch as he rubbed his nose, perhaps a misguided attempt to disguise his unbridled curiosity. I nodded, then cleared my throat. Paul looked behind, seeing the man, and turned back towards me. "You already know what happened last night," I said in a silenced tone. He started to smile as a tear rose from his bottom eyelid. To tell the truth, that was a common thing for him. The man brushed the snow off his boots with the mat, leaving 2 trails of melting ice nestled within their grooves. Upon realizing it was no use and the boots were still invaded by the white frost, he took them off very slowly and left them outside, his hand showing the slightest sign of a shake. I began to speak as he gently closed the door behind him. Last night, He looked up towards me. I saw her and him. I don't know how, but I did.
You know, I've never seen your family or even heard you talk about them.
"Paul," I said.
And I've never seen you put up any photos, call or receive any text from your parents. Not that I would, because we're not that connected, but...
"Paul," I repeated.
And not even anything for the walls, for that matter. Not so much as a painting. What have you got against some creative...
"I saw her," I said. That single tear finally rolled down. with more following soon after. He threw his hands over his mouth, a redness invading his face.
Was she okay?
No, I said without hesitation. He put a hand against my wall to catch himself from falling.
Was she...
I paused, but that was an answer in itself, because he nodded.
Yeah.
He stood up right then, his hand no longer correcting his posture. His eyes, which used to be full of sadness, were replaced by something else. Anger.
Yeah.
I thought back to the time I was caught between the great space, and remembered the frantic pointing that the woman did. And that's when I realized that he already knew the answer. His wife was pregnant when she died. His bottom lip folded over the top, quivering.
Tell me something, Eskel.
I nodded.
Have you ever been in love?
No, I responded. He nodded, looking all around my home. But as I followed his gaze, I saw it was leading nowhere.
You're one of the lucky ones.
He said, letting out a chuckle. But that wasn't faking anything, as a redness still stifled the color of his face.
I've got 3 kids out there in that car. I'm going to go back and tell them about how you saw their mummy, because I've already told them why I drive here every morning, about the meetings with the medium. I'm going to have to leave that part out, about their extra sibling. Do you know why, Eskel?
I shook my head, yet again.
I'm sterile. Because I'm sterile.
He cupped his right hand into a fist, its form shaking rapidly, as I was preparing for him to punch a hole through my wall.
We were in a car accident. I'm sure you've heard about it, right? Everyone around here has.
I had no idea what he was speaking about. Noticing my confusion, he elaborated.
It was an accident. That's what it was. It was a week after she flew here to be with me, and she started driving again, and...
His voice trailed, but I knew what he was speaking about, even if he didn't say. Cerila, like me, came from the United States, and to here, England. I'd heard stories about people driving on the wrong side of the road sometimes, especially when coming from a country whose road laws are flipped in that regard. Connecting the dots, I figured the truth before it was given to me. She drove on the wrong side and collided into oncoming traffic.
But it was all my fault. I should have paid more attention. I should have known. I should have fucking known. The car was flipped. The whole thing was just upside down. I looked at her and I thought she was dead. I carried her to the hospital. Our phones were busted, and she still cheated on me after all this time, after all we've been through. So you know what, Eskel? You and I, we're in the same boat. No true love. Does it even exist?
He said.
Cerila Obellum. Turns out she did hide something from me, right? I knew something was up when I picked the test up from the trash. She kept telling me, Paul, it was just a fluke. No, Cerila, our relationship was a fucking fluke, and now you and your fucking baby are dead.
My hand was shaking at my side, but not because of the emotion. I noticed a bag just off the side of the front door, the lumps that it held protruding enough for me to guess what was inside. But as I'd noticed those lumps, even spotting one that seemed to be moving, he caught me looking.
Oh, this? This?
He moved over to the bag.
This is your payment.
He picked it up and handed it to me.
This should cover it.
Thanks, I said.
You're very welcome. I'm glad you get such a kick off of...
He stopped.
If you ever see her again, if that's even possible, Eskel, I want you to tell her that I'm sorry.
Afterwards, he raised 2 fingers and rubbed his eyes, and then went back through the front door. But before he'd left, I saw both his hands ball into a fist, with one of them opening itself so he could grab the knob and slam the door. After the loud slam, I peered through the window. His beat-up Ford Fiesta was just outside, with 3 tiny heads gawking from the back passenger seats. They were bouncing up and down as their father approached them. One in particular was boosted by a car seat. It must have been the youngest. She held a long-haired doll in her hand, which was matching the style of her mother. It had a bow, something I hadn't seen Cerila wear in the place between. The young girl picked at the doll's hair as if she was fixing it as her father got in the car. Only moments later, I heard the sound of his puffing engine until it was nothing but a distant blare. I closed the blinds. The client was satisfied. The bag was still in my hands. It was heavier than I'd imagined it to be. My heart started to skip thinking about the amount he would pay, something he conveniently left out in our meetings. I grabbed the small zipper, pulling it down to reveal a delicious green inside. Stacks. My hands frolicked inside of it, grabbing stack upon stack and arranging it on the table. It was the most I was ever paid. Surely this would be enough to cover the next several months of the house, something I was struggling to bear. But I couldn't believe it. When I counted the amounts held within, my hand shaking as each stack crumbled with my pressure. It must have been up in the thousands, even the 10,000s. I thought of the things I could do or see, the places I would go. What was initially for bills could be for so much more. I could renovate my house, go out into that fancy new place downtown, hell, even hire a maid. Then, I felt it. That sharp numbness. It was still at the side of my head, begging to be recognized again. The crinkling muscle moving without purpose. With the 10,000, maybe I'll go see a professional doctor for once, I thought. After that, the rush of ideas faded. Instead, I opted for a smell. Doused in glistening syrup, the pancakes laid upon a plate practically begging to be eaten. Plumes of smoke rose just under the lights of the kitchen, and they followed me out of it. I sat down on the couch of the adjoining living room, feeling the cushion of the furniture absorb me. In front of me was a foldable TV tray, taken from the pantry, all prepared to host the delicious meal which I was just setting upon it. Afterwards, I reached for the remote sitting on a nearby coffee table, and watched the flicker of the television ignite the dust dancing in the air. On the small rectangular box, there was nothing but the familiarities. A local golf tournament in which the rich played just to get a tiny bit richer. And then elsewhere, on another channel, penguins huddling to contain heat among each other in a great blizzard. But on another, the local news. A lady with the most beautiful, welcoming smile looked toward the camera. Documents were in her hand before being set down on a table in front of her. Panels upon panels filled the screen, filled with animated text. She opened her lips.
A local elementary school is preparing to have its 6th annual egg dropping tournament, in which the lucky student who doesn't crack the egg receives a letter A grade and a free ice cream cone. The school, however, is promising that all broken eggs will be put to good use and used in various other school-related projects. On the contrary, a new local project is showing the dangerous repercussions of living in memory instead of looking to the future.
Her voice became a muffled tune to my ears, and as I took more delicious bites, I glanced only occasionally to her moving jaw as she gave the spiel over the happenings around Middle Point, England. But just as my eyes met the steaming plate, I'd recognized I'd seen something when I last glanced at her. My eyes regressed back to that woman yet again, and I was right. It was just below her bottom eyelid, slowly moving its darkened shape until it stood upon her pupil. I felt the same eye of mine wince. How couldn't she feel that? I wondered. It had many legs, some sort of insect it seemed. It continued crawling until it met her hair. It blended seamlessly then, right into the color. I drove my head forward, my spine adjusting to the lean. I kept trying to find that small object in the cluster of hair, but I couldn't spot it. When I'd given up, I decided to stand, gently moving the tray out of my way. My eyes scrutinized the pixels that were becoming more apparent with each step towards the television. Her face continued, unbothered, the news arriving at its regular pace, and then I'd seen it. The spider scurried out of the hair into the edge of the screen. There, it stepped upon the television's frame, one of its many legs rising and then touching the backside of the television set. It was real, I'd realized. It pulled itself up until it was on the very top of the TV, then rushed to the back. In response, my hands hooked upon the box and turned it around, spilling the living light upon the plastic backside. A web was entangled amidst the plastic shielding. Its faint lines shimmered as it was revealed to me, a glimmer surging through every inch of its tangling complex. The spider stood there upon the web, the glistens of its 8 legs angled towards my sight. Every once in a while, when the back-facing television screen would flicker to some other scene, the small hints of hair atop its legs were ignited by the sudden change in light. It was watching me, I was sure of it. That disgusting, terrible creature. And then it stepped to the side, revealing something just behind it. A prey was nestled into these lines. It shook feverishly, its little wings trying to flutter. But the more the wings rose in the air, the more they snapped back onto the body. Constricted, it was a fly, a stifling buzz muffled, yet audible. The spider started a slow walk toward the creature, its venomous fangs quivering as it approached the victim that could only sit there. I looked behind me, a napkin laid upon the television tray, a corner rising because of the ceiling fan. I returned my eyes to the web, and I saw the spider continue its slow strut. In a hurry, I grabbed the corner of the napkin and returned to the back of the screen. Then, it was gone. The spider wasn't there anymore. But those beady little eyes were still watching, and in my direction, its wings still rising and falling. The spider didn't eat it? The lines still crossed that fly, tangling him into the webbed lines of silk. I swatted the web away, pulling the insect with a steady hand. The web still had bits and pieces stuck to the fly, but they weren't enough to stop his flying. I sat him down upon the television stand and eagerly awaited his ascent. But then, it didn't happen. I gently tapped it, its body rocking back and forth. For the first time, its wings never rose. And then I'd remembered the fangs the spider drew, the ones that threatened to puncture into the poor soul's body. In the time I was away, the spider must have made it, the venom paralyzing the victim and eventually liquefying the insides, rendering it nothing but a physical carcass. But the spider never got a chance to finish its meal. It just killed it, leaving it a splashing shell. Why? That's when the writhing came again. Muscles contracted, moving on their own.
Darling,
A raspy, feminine voice interrupted.
you look cold.
My eyelids drew themselves together, and, after a time, opened back up. In the place of my home, in that flickering, animated television, that familiar haze which surrounded Cerila. But as my eyes traversed across everything visible, I spotted a shadow extending towards my direction. I turned around, and there she was, but it was not Cerila. A woman stood there, watching me from a distance. But this time, in contrast to Cerila's spotting, the woman's edges were not ebbing away from some glass pane. No. Instead, they were clearly defined, and every detail came to me as it must have been. An old woman whose pale face was cocked to the side and gazed at me in admiration. Despite the brightness of the haze that surrounded her, the color of her irises stood out. Their blue shone beautifully, piercing through the encasing fog and right towards me. But when I gazed to define the color or shape of what she was wearing, it changed, and so did her shoes, her socks, her hair color, and everything. Though strangely, not the eyes. But no matter what, she donned blue eyes and a dress. She pinched that dress, her wrinkled head gazing at it.
It looks nice, doesn't it?
Her shaky voice asked.
It's my favorite one. Do you have favorite clothes?
The old woman slowly tilted her wrinkled head to the other side. She was warm, comforting, even if she was older. And as she stood there, her vision attached to mine, I felt a mysterious tug to hug her, and then I felt a gust push against my skin. When my eyes met below, I saw my bare skin, with every bodily feature laid bare. The skin of my head succumbed to a beet red, an instant wind pushing into my pores. Shivering, I took a step back, folding my hands under my armpits.
It's okay.
She replied, noticing my embarrassment. I took a few steps away from her and into the haze.
Sweetie, where are you going? Out there.
She asked. I looked behind me and saw the very edge of the bubble. Darkness existed just past it.
Come inside. It's cold out. A gust has picked up, and it's not very pleasant. You must be freezing.
I opened my mouth to speak, but there was nothing. That constriction happened again, the same one felt with Cerila. It made my lips bring themselves back just as fast as they were opening. She tilted her head.
Will you come inside?
Without a thought, I nodded. But as soon as its motion was over, I'd realized I hadn't known why I answered that. The corner of her lips rose to form a warm smile.
That's what I like to hear.
But there was no inside like she'd mentioned. Surrounding us was nothing besides that bulbous shape and the haze in it. My lips continued their attempts at embodying a language to no avail, to ask her where this was. She turned her body away from mine, only showing her backside. Then, the fog behind her started to glisten even further, its hue shifting with every passing second. It began to shine, just like when Cerila looked to the horizon. For a moment, she dropped her head. That's when I heard it. The sound of everything. A tune came over the multicolored fog, bouncing between the wall and floorless realm. When the song made it to me, great inspiration filled my being. And in only a second, my mind made the choice to step away from that darkness and further into the bubble. Almost as if she'd known my decision, she took one step towards the dense fog that was near her, the same one that was glistening so vividly in front of her. During this, she still faced away from me. The haze's extreme shine began to shift her edges, like peering through a kaleidoscope. And then she took one step to the side, no longer adjacent to me. 4 walls, a floor, and a roof surrounded her. An entire house flickering into existence with no premonition of creation right where she stood. She dropped her shoulders and rotated her way back to me, with one dastardly smile, yet friendly all the same. She motioned me closer. I took one step, and then a door appeared just ahead of her, blocking our sight. By then, it sat upon a porch, and this porch itself held a bizarre design, which was decorated by an array of paintings. So many, in fact, that many of them were falling down, or in the process of doing so. A group of rustic chairs stood upon this same platform, with cracked steps rising from the ground into the floor of which they sat. The chairs were entangled in webs and thick layers of dust, like nobody's used them for years, aside from the paintings that sat in them. Yes, in addition to the porch laden by the paintings, the chairs held stacks of them. The door creaked open, and the woman's little head filled that narrow space created between the door and the door frame. But as I stared at her face, I was drawn to an intricate pattern embroidered upon the surface of the surrounding structure. Its curving, interwoven lines went through the porch and up to the walls above, to which my vision followed. Windows filled the surface that was detailed by this pattern, with silhouettes filling the windows' multicolored lights. The shadows were all people, and all partaking in their own unique motions, but all dancing to the same tune, the one spilling out from the half-opened door. Their movements were different, but they were all trying to match that harmonious echo in the air, and now bending through the open doorway. I didn't notice it at first, but the more I stared, the more I'd realized the building looked as though it was plucked out of the 18th century. My eyes met the many spots in which this fact made itself clear. The roof of the establishment, for instance, had a slated chimney and plumes of smoke rising from it, but not the type you'd see inserted into houses of our modern era. And the pattern I'd been tracing reminded me of photos that I'd seen from early civilization, from those buildings sitting on vast roads of gravel and horse-led buggies. The old woman snickered, causing my eyes to snap back to her. The front entrance was, bizarrely, now double-doored, and had a knocker instead of a doorbell. It swung as the old woman rocked the door back and forth, her head still poking. Her eyes were meeting mine this entire time, despite my digress. She must have had quite the patience, I noticed, and then I saw her glance down. I followed her vision, and just then, a warmness tickled the in-betweens of my toes. I looked down to spot the culprit and saw tufts of grass extending from between. But the tufts of grass, they had shadows, and they were ignited by a light that seemed extremely natural. I looked up to spot the source and saw a powerful blue fill the sky. This was the first time I'd ever seen anything like this in this place. A real atmosphere. But it wasn't there before. In fact, everything seemed to have changed slightly, in the same way the old woman's appearance shifted constantly. I bent down to feel the touch of the green, the edges of the grass prodding into my skin. And that's when I noticed something strange about them. I pulled one out of the ground and brought it closer to my eye. It looked normal, as though any other blade outside this place, but the edges, they were jagged. This doesn't make any sense, I thought. Like they were done by a shaken...
It's so cold out, isn't it?
The peeking head asked again, interrupting my train of thought. The cold gust ran through my pores again, juxtaposed to the heat of the swarming green. I nodded, and then I approached the slowly opening door. The house wasn't much like a house when entered. It was one of the most spacious buildings I'd ever seen, and resembled more like a hotel. You would glance to the ceiling and see what looked like hundreds of stories, with a giant staircase connecting each one. The view of the roof was partially obscured due to a gigantic chandelier which hung from it, the great light falling so far that its very last edge was adjacent to the second floor. Several lights extended from it, and it seemed to be spinning. As I stared, my eyes spun with it. My eyes gradually lowered themselves, drifting over every available detail. The music that emitted in this giant structure came from a record player, sitting just in the corner of the room. The same calming music that advanced through the haze outside. The way the player was designed made it seem older, just like the appearance of the building outside. However, it also looked as good as new, with no dust settling amid the surface.
Nothing like a good song. Keeps those legs moving. Of course, back in my day, we hadn't anything like that. No. Nothing as fancy as that little old thing in the corner.
The song was a strange one, but not because of its age. There was something funny about the way the song was composed, like there was a distortion or second track playing behind it. It was hard to hear and drowned out by the music that was ahead of it, but this ulterior sound was there and came in waves. As my ears tuned themselves to that second layer, my eyes felt heavy. She made her way over to me, her eyes matching mine.
It even plays stereo,
she said, as though it was a big revelation. She waited for my response, and when I gave none, she repeated,
Stereo.
The disc in the record player was labelless, as though it had no origin. Nevertheless, it spun, the unusual tune from its rotation meeting our ears. But even stranger than the disc was this lobby around us. In contrast to the old-school exterior, what was inside glistened in a more modern appearance. The intricate pattern was only present outside and not in, and simple patterns filled the walls and tiled floor of this first floor. But as my mind noted the inconsistencies, the glimmer of that strong light descending from the roof snapped me back to the chandelier.
The light heats us up,
the woman said, taking notice of my miring.
It's plenty enough, isn't it?
She wobbled away from the music player and towards the hanging light, putting her hand on the dusty handrail of the stairs that existed just beneath it. Around the hanging chandelier, on every adjacent surface, a great spaceless bundle of finely adjusted paintings hung on the walls. They were the same ones spilling out onto the porch. The old woman had an acute fascination with them, as, when she walked, her fingers met upon the frame of each and let out a smile. No part of the wall existed without a painting, and they were all hanging perfectly. My eyes traveled along the surface, noting all the paintings to which filled it, and then right at the top. But I noticed something as my vision focused closer to the roof. The colors of the paintings became more faded, an obvious fact even if they grew less in scale and subsequently harder to see. Thick layers of dust were extending from them, another fact making it seem as though they had become older and less touched. In some spots where paintings struggled to hang, some actually overlapped one another, and in others, it was a miracle that they didn't fall. As the details of the paintings became less and less obvious, eventually descending into a state of color instead of depicted shapes, my focus continued its ascent until I met the very first one right below the roof. It was a giant painting of nothing, a great canvas of white with nothing seen.
That's my favorite one,
the woman said. Her finger started to point at the one I was staring at and shook as it protruded the air. As my eyes pored over the painting, a frozen man flickered into existence right in it. He stood in the great white, the painting now focusing upon him. He was naked, nude, like me. Her voice struggled, trailing off. It looked like a model painting. He stood in the void with his eyes glaring towards us, at what was likely the painter who created him. In fact, his blue irises gave a small yet noticeable reflection, as though the painter spent so much time on the work that he thought to include a reflection of himself. She continued, still unable to speak. His hair held a youthful blonde, but more than that, a curved mustache sat placidly upon his topmost lip, to which he had been caressing and clearly cared a lot about. He wasn't smiling, but life danced vividly in his eyes. But as I'd recognized his detail, a flash of brown overtook his yellow. His hair changed, and as I recognized this, his mustache simply disappeared. His entire look shifted, just like the old woman did when I first met her. As I noted this, I turned my head back to the old woman. Her physical characteristics changed as well, and the more I'd stared at her newfound black hair and freckles, the more I'd realized it. Everything around me was changing after just a few passing minutes. The patterns on the walls, the way she and those paintings looked.
He was my husband,
the old woman was finally able to say.
That's how I first saw him. He stood there, just like that, in the vast space. But there was something electrifying about him. About the way he spoke. He gave me a new purpose, and we were hooked ever since.
I tilted my head at his gaze. Of everything that changed, the one thing that remained were his blue eyes. The reflection upon his eye tilted as I did, as though matching me. Then I looked over to those small yet visible paintings held near his head. In one, this exact house we were standing in, and in another, that exact woman to my side, the exact way she'd looked now. Did he paint them? I didn't notice it before, but several self-paintings like that first man filled the wall, except they were only slightly smaller than her husband. They each focused on a particular human subject, with smaller ones hanging nearby that represented objects instead. For instance, around a second man who wore a long black beard in similar nudity, a painting of a horse and a carriage. Rain splashed against the depicted horse, the animal lowering its head to shield himself. The texture of the road was composed of stone and gravel, not asphalt, and a shadow that looked like the bearded man was cast upon its surface, just out of frame, as though he was the painter. Several other obscure creations neighbored the man in his horsed photo, each teeming with their own curiosity. For instance, a photo of a feminine physique sitting on a bed, her hand extending just beyond a drape to draw the painter and that recurring man's shadow in.
When he left, I couldn't believe it. There was nothing left for me to do anymore. I thought about giving up, but I couldn't. I couldn't do that. Instead,
When I peered closer to where I was standing, I saw more figures of a similar organization. People whose painted figures were blown in scale and surrounded by smaller paintings. In fact, this entire wall seemed to be a combination of a person of interest and several other smaller paintings surrounding them, all extending from this gigantic portrait of the husband. Did they create these works? The people tucked away in the swarm of artwork must have been the painters. And, like the artwork surrounding the bearded man, a shadow was painted upon each one of their creations, resembling the painters themselves. It seemed they all thought to include themselves in these illustrations. During my descending gaze, I noticed faint twinkles emerge from each floor. The chandelier wasn't the only one casting any light. In addition to the great one hanging from above, I spotted light shining from beyond multicolored doors. Each one had a different array of color that illuminated its edges, some pulsating as though whatever was behind it was particularly animated. They existed on every plane, on every floor you could see, alongside the paintings. When my examination landed back at the ground level, I approached one such door that pierced a wall next to me. Just as my feet were only millimeters away from the blockade, I smelled something I never smelled before. Something I couldn't depict. I put my hand upon its knob and began to twist. Midway through its rotation, the knob froze, unable to move any further. An audible click emitted from it, showing it was going nowhere. It was locked. Realizing I wouldn't be going inside, I pushed my ear against the door.
Going to sound cheesy.
A voice from beyond said. It paused for a minute, and then continued.
Fine. I like to stare out there. The stars, you know?
But strangely, the voice was met by nothing. There wasn't a response, yet it responded anyways, as if someone commented on what it just said.
I know. He's right. But I still gawk at it. I guess. These are the things you remember for the rest of your life. Moments like these.
But the voice, the more it spoke, echoed from my brain. I remembered hearing it before, but yet again, I hadn't. This was a new one. I'd never heard this, yet at the same time, I'd sworn I did. I turned my head forward and took a step back, staring at the texture of the door. The light that was emitting from its sides, giving the slightest hint at what was held behind it, was a mixture of black and white. It danced along, each color fading into each other. The more I stared, I felt a great energy flow through me, a rejuvenation of some design. Interruptingly, I glanced over to that old woman. She was over upon the staircase, rotating a disconnected painting that hadn't yet met the wall she was facing. In the painting, faint speckles of color were patterned among a great canvas of bluish black, representing the stars. At the bottom, silhouettes existed of two figures. Trees stood above them, their shadows stretching across the bodies of the two small silhouettes. What is she doing? I thought. It looks like what I just heard.
we hope to have more in soon.
She hadn't looked at me, but somehow knew I was staring.
Paintings, I mean, but also guests. But they do go hand in hand these days. I can almost hear them entering the same door you went through.
She struggled to find a place to hang the painting, her head swiveling in all directions as to pinpoint a clear area which hadn't already been overstuffed.
Though sometimes, I will admit, it is a process to hang these.
After a while, the elderly woman set the painting of the stars upon the floor, leaning it against the wall. Then she looked around for a bit, scouring across the illustrated works before grabbing one. The painting her hands met showed a long-running field, and just in the center, as the focus of the work, a dog sitting amidst the blades of grass. The animal stared at the painter with a playful gaze, its eyes locking with something just out of frame. The only way the painter's physique was visible was from the shadow cast along the grass, and in his shadow was what looked like a hand holding a bone. But strangely, the other hand, instead of painting something, was off to his side. At this realization, I asked myself, then how was he able to... But then, in a great tug, the woman pulled the work off the wall. Every light, the chandelier and the lights behind the doors, lost intensity immediately, and the nearby music was shifted into its second, ulterior layer, seamlessly. Then, moments after, a tickling sensation disturbed my neck. When my fingers felt the area, it was moist, as though I'd begun to sweat. Her hands relaxed, dropping the painting of the dog and man straight to the floor with little care. With one swift kick, she slid it to the side to permit herself more room, and then bent herself down to pick up the leaning picture of the stars. When her posture straightened, she held it out in front of her, peering at the piece of work. She nodded her head and, in a few quick steps, locked it onto the wall where the last rested. For a minute, the lights continued their diminishment, a great darkness invading every possible thing. The old woman in front of me, in the tossing light, took a step back, her hands clenching so hard that her palms turned white. She looked at me with those eyes, and the way those eyes were. But then the lights returned, the bluish-black space-oriented artwork now hanging with thousands of other paintings.
That was a close one. I almost woke them all up.
Woke them all up, I thought. But how could they be asleep when I saw them dancing in the windows? But as soon as she'd finished, a scream beckoned my gaze. It emerged from a room, a masculine voice beaming in horror. The light behind its doorway started to flicker, brightening, yet losing intensity as time went on. I looked towards the old woman. She merely shrugged and then returned to those paintings in front of me. When I looked back, steam rose from the edges of the screamer's doorframe. The light inside, just beyond the door, quit its emission and shifted to darkness. And then I saw it. Some sort of water seeped from under, moving out of the room and into this lobby. The elderly woman commanded my attention.
Now, where were we? Oh, right. You've got one.
Her voice sounded off as though it was met with a tinge of insincerity. Her eyes continued to meet mine, not going anywhere. I raised one eyebrow and gave a slight squint at her confusing statement. In response, she moved her eyes to the ground just behind me, and then started pointing. Realizing this, I whirled myself around.
Yes, that shadow. You've got one.
A shadow stretched from my feet and across the tiled floor. I knelt down, pressing my fingers against the darkened ground. But as I lowered myself, the shadow took twice as long to react. And even when it did, it was slightly off, displaying my head like it was still facing forward despite not being so. Behind me, I heard the old woman's breath become uneven. Curious, I redirected my gaze. She was dancing along the stairs to the tune of that returning music, staring down at her shadow as it tried to match her shape.
We seldom speak about them, but they matter so much. So beautiful. So divine. So very great.
It seemed she hadn't realized the shadow was off. While mimicking the tune, her shadow lagged behind in inches. As she partook in some strange movement while experimenting with the black reflection that emerged from her, my sight locked with the color sitting just behind her dancing body. In an artwork held behind her sprawling hair, the painter devised several plates laying across an empty tabletop. On their surfaces, a thick brown liquid was encased like a membrane and then fell off of the plate's edges, filling the grooves of the table. But unlike the other ones above, this particular piece was not held near a subject's head. In fact, all the paintings near it hadn't been for a significant portion of the wall. But there was something strange about the one plate that was at the center, the focus of the whole thing. Its lighting was different, as if it had a faint glimmer in difference to the others, and crumbs filled this particular plate. The painter chose this plate over the rest to give the most detail to, as if this closest plate was the most important, as though it served a function beyond the others.
We don't know who made this one anymore, but aren't they wonderful?
I nodded. It made me wonder where the painter began when they made all of this. Did their press begin with the first, most detailed plate? Or perhaps the other, more simplistic ones? These questions would not stop arriving. This train of thought was interrupted when I felt a warm palm press against my own. I looked down at my hand and saw her clasping it.
This way!
In one wobbly step, she started our ascent up the staircase. Moments later, when we made it to the second floor and off that staircase, we glanced towards a cornucopia of surrounding hallways that each extended from one another. My legs began to quake, eager to explore every one. There was something fascinating about each door such hallways held, the sounds, smells, and lights that poured from them. I got my first taste downstairs, and I was ready for more.
Excited, are you?
She asked, giving a curious look.
This place has that aura to it, doesn't it?
No kidding, I wanted to say.
But I'm afraid you'll have to stop doing that now.
I looked at her, a sadness surging through my being.
Because that one's for you,
she said, playfully, pointing to something afar. And that's when I saw it. The one for me. It stood at the end of a particular hallway. But unlike the other hallways, this narrow corridor had only 8 doors.
It's a special one in a hallway reserved for our best members. We had someone there before, in your room, but they've since moved away. I think it would look great with you.
I looked at her, and she nodded again, but just after she rubbed her nose, her gaze shifting to those other doors. Why am I considered a best member? I wanted to ask, but I was still unable to speak, that feeling of restriction making itself known. The door grew in size as my feet trudged across the floor's carpet. With each step I took, I smelled more smells, heard more sounds, all emerging from the passing rooms.
Professional players with feedback. These people are the ones putting in multiple hours a day. Maybe I shouldn't be here, but I kind of ran out of choices. Green is not a creative color.
For nearly every single one, I wanted to stop, to investigate. But as I approached my own, I pushed the thought down. It was so close. Goosebumps formed along the surface of my skin as it grew in scale. I could feel the texture, that wooden striae. I imagined putting my finger on it, feeling the warmth, the energy that would pulsate from it like the ones downstairs. But then my legs stopped their movement. I turned my head to meet those elderly blue eyes, but they were nowhere to be found. Instead, I kept locking onto the neighboring doors, but not the nice lady who'd led me here. I looked forward again, and there it was right in front of me. The door. My door. I put my hand upon the doorknob while expecting the warmth, but that did not happen. It was cold. The frigid feeling spread from my fingers to my palm, even to my nails. In pale contrast to the rest of them, this particular door was infused with anything but heat, making me shiver when it touched my hand. For a moment, something told me to turn back, to leave this place. But it was right here. I couldn't leave when I'd made it this far. In one great motion, I turned the knob and pushed the door. Not a single detail was ignited by the door's opening, not even with the great light shining into the room. Only small tufts of carpet rising from the floor were illuminated. Best member, I wondered. If I was such a best member, then why would I be given an empty room with not an ounce of light, smell, or movement inside? I looked back towards the doors comprising the walls next to me. It was unfair. They were glistening, the lights shining behind them, giving off an unfathomable aura. What did I do to deserve this? A thought begged to know. Why would she tell me? And then instantly, I received an answer.
An empty room can mean a lot to someone.
A feminine voice slithered from within. I squinted into the darkness, but saw nothing held within it except a loose silhouette. It faced away from me, its darkened shape poised over the ground, and their hands tending to something on the carpet. After a moment, the figure rose and then turned around. As the hallway light revealed this turning woman, a golden glisten emerged from the great black. It was a necklace, glistening from the lights that drew into the room. Its intricate shape dangled in the air and just off of this feminine figure. The necklace held multiple beams with a variety of multicolored gems slid through each. But one of these stood out to me. Where one was supposed to hold some color, there was emptiness, glass by its lonesome, with no gem behind it at all. And it was all alone. As I stared, I noted the beautifully blonde hair that fell from her scalp and to her shoulders. Some hair follicles twisted into the necklace. The corners of her lips rose, forming a smile from the darkness. Then she, along with it, grew in size. As this occurred, her teeth began to glisten, and the light spilling from the hallway revealed an intricate, multicolored pattern embroidered upon her dress, now revealed from her walking closer to me. When she was only a foot away, I saw her closer than ever, but there was something odd. She took one of her fingers and rubbed its knuckle against her eye socket as if she had an itch, and then something deep inside of me realized it. I'd seen those eyes before, but I didn't remember seeing them before, all at the same time. She went past me, her hand gripping the doorknob to leave. She began to twist it, ushering me into the room until I was out of the hallway. When I made it inside, she took a step out, her edges illuminated by the hallway's yellow light. But then her movement stalled. She looked at me again, her eyes wincing as if experiencing pain.
Take good care of him.
She pulled the door towards her, causing what I saw of her to become thinner and thinner. But before the door closed, she cupped one of the gems hanging from her necklace. She ran her thumb against it, into the indentations that comprised it. But it was the one that emitted nothing. Soon after, a tear fell into the exact spot she was rubbing. And, just after, the twinkle of blue filled that space, the space that previously held not a shade. "Wait!" I wanted to yell, but instead a murmur emitted from within me, no voice accompanying it. When the last of the light vanished due to her closing of the door, the only source bleeding from the underside of the doorframe, I saw the shadows of her 2 feet walk away from the other side. She was gone. But I was in it now, the room. As I stood within, my entire body was masked by the darkness's grip. My legs, arms, and any other part of my body, they were all disguised by it, and I could only feel their presence. I looked around, hoping my eyes would focus, which revealed nothing but the continuous black void. And then it was there. Along the wall, an admission of light poured through a crack. I approached it, watching its sprawling figure become more detailed. Off the crack was one more, extending across the surface. They were connected, like 2 entangled entities. Between the edges that formed the connected cracks, lights poured through, coming from the other side of the wall. Part of the hallway was on the other side, its light being the culprit. But a faint, small shadow emerged from its center, where both cracks were connected. Wondering what it was, I motioned my head closer, squinting my eyes to combat the defocusing darkness. 8 tiny legs emerged from within, pushing a connected body out of the crack. From the darkness, it was shrouded, but when I saw the 8 tiny glistens following its movement, I knew exactly what it was. A spider. With the backside of my hand, I drifted over it, attempting to swat it away. When my hand emerged away from the insect I just touched, the spider still stood there, seemingly unscathed. It turned until its head was towards me. The insect angled itself farther to the light, as though it was peering to the crack. When it did so, the 8 eyes reflected the light passing from it, and then my sight began to malform. The stare I held against the spider turned completely dark. For a moment, I wondered if the crack had disappeared, if the darkness had disguised it like everything else in the room. But just as this thought crossed my mind, the room came back to view, though at a different angle. My body felt different. The numbness persisted, sure, but some underbelly within this nothing was alarming me. And as my internal alarms rang with certainty that something was wrong, the spider reappeared, but it was larger. In fact, it was my size. That tiny little thing, my size? It had no movement, standing there, frozen, but a shimmer rocked it through and through, interrupting the colors of its body. With its edges shivering as though cast in a mirror, I started to move, to get away from that disgustingly frozen insect, the one causing me so much trouble. But as I moved myself, I had to do so with great force. And then the spider moved too. And that's when I realized it. I was the spider. A giant face hovered above me. It gave a bleak stare, and the stare was what reflected the spider. Me. The 2 gigantic eyeballs scowled at my small, 8-legged frame, those same legs trembling, the fangs that rose from my head doing all the same, all reflected within the pupils, the same pupils I wore only moments ago. As my new form stumbled back, its many legs pushing against the surface of the wall, that giant hand rose, and down it came, onto me. Then the darkness overcame the light once more, and when I fought to reveal the room again, it returned back to the way it was before I became the spider. I yanked myself back, my pupils no longer settling on top of it. I wanted no part in the pain it experienced, no chance to serve the creature that only wanted to live. But as my eyes left the spider caught within the crack, it burrowed itself within. The spider was gone. Did I cause it to hide? Was I the reason it wouldn't stand between any longer? But as I breathed a sigh of relief, I saw those tiny glistens again. It stood back between the cracks, the light rays curving around the returning insect. It never emerged from where it left, as though it simply teleported back to where it was standing a moment earlier. Eventually, it crawled back into the laceration with the same exact movement as its earlier counterpart. What the hell? I thought. Enough was enough. I surrounded the doorknob with my palm and began to twist it. But then I heard the click. The knob refused to rotate. My fingers started to pick at the center of the knob, blindly looking for a lock of some kind. But there was nothing. When I drifted my hand away from the knob, my heart's fast, rhythmic beat fumbled. My eyes met this strange anomaly, that thing upon the knob. It was an arm that looked like mine, almost exactly so, save for a gray that tinted it. But the thing was, my arm was now at my side. So it wasn't mine, and yet it was there, still trying to turn the knob, still trying to open the door. A fear stalled my breath. My lungs struggled to function and inhale, incalculable. I was stuck in here. I threw balls of fists upon the door, hearing pound upon pound. That didn't work. I raised my foot, pushing against the wooden structure over and over in a fast motion to kick. That didn't work either. The darkness started to push against me, surrounding me in ways it had before, yet I hadn't cared to notice. This whole room was just that, I thought. A vast space entangling me, a place to take me away from the heat outside. Before I could finish that thought, a strange new voice beamed into my ear.
You can't go there. You can't go in.
I turned in response, jolting to meet the source. But instead of finding some face, some creature in the dark, I just saw the overwhelming black.
You can't trust them. They are afraid.
The voices whispered again. I continued to kick the door, doing so louder and louder. The voices rose themselves in response, to match my animosity.
Do you think this is a home? That this is all a home?
My legs began to quake, the upper parts of my body feeling as though they'd grown 60 pounds in only a few seconds. But I kept kicking. Bang! Bang! It was no use. The door bounced back when it would indent, and the sound was attracting nobody. But yet, bang, bang, over and over for what felt like an eternity. All for no result. But despite the kick's persistence, despite my continuance of banging upon that doorway out of that terrible, terrible place, it all fell flat. My legs slowed their ways, my brain's clamoring to survive ending itself slower and slower, until my legs felt a great numbness.
Give in.
The voices chimed.
Give in.
They wanted this. The chorus rose in volume as they championed to my lobes and eventually into my mind.
Give in.
They started to burrow themselves like ticks into my head, into the mind that led me into this hellhole of a space. My lips opened as though by themselves. Give in, I whispered. Give in. I felt nothing at that point. I was nothing. I was that darkness around me now. With that dwindling crack, the voices rising to disturb the harmonious outside. Guilt nestled itself into me like a spider tying its prey. Like a spider tying its prey? In the final moments of consciousness, a water droplet drooped down my skin. Then it was followed by another, and then another, and another. Before I could note it, before I could mark that puddle forming below me, surely my mind stopped. I felt only the void then. The darkness won, and I was nothing now. But there she stood, among a suddenly appearing great beam of orange. There she stood.
Oh, this won't do, will it? We can relocate if you'd prefer.
The hair along my arms stood together as the light returned to them, waving in the darkness as a gust of wind pushed them back. But they returned, standing back up just when the gust cleared. But my smile faltered when I saw him standing behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. Paul. The old woman's face matched my grimace. She opened her lips for a moment as to speak, but this was interrupted when she looked down to the palm stretched across her body. Then she locked eyes with Paul, who kept his gaze towards me.
You're being watched,
she said with a nefarious slither, still facing him. She took her eyes off that spectating man, and then brought them back to me.
I can see it in your eyes, those 2 layers. The recollection.
I closed my eyelids. She was right. I felt the force of the lids draw together again right after, as though another pair existed above the first. As I recall this, I am realizing what this finally meant. That recollection. With my vision blocked by the eyelids, the sound of a violent shuffle took place, and then I heard a soft breath emit from right next to my ear. Right above that same ear, her soft voice carried itself through.
Life beyond inception requires a sacrifice.
I felt the soft press of her finger, and then my skin, feeling the amounting pressure she'd begun to exert, started to writhe. And then I woke up to the sound, my eyes focusing back to the television poised in front of me. I was laying upon the ground, great bits of sweat squishing just below my shaken body. I must have fallen when I noted the spider, I thought. But everything had disappeared. The loose bits of webbing were gone and nowhere to be found, and the fly had been moved too. But the voice of the reporter was still occurring on the other side of the back-facing screen. I pushed my body up and, while taking a breath, locked my hands upon each side of the television frame and rotated it until the reporter's face met mine. The darling reporter was still there, yet was now speaking in a rushed tone. Documents she was holding were pushed further along the tabletop and away from where she was sitting. As of now, she was staring at the camera in fixation, her eyes sternly focused on it and nothing else.
A Ford Fiesta has veered off the road into Lakers Pond. Reports from residents in the area say they've heard muffled screams just an hour ago, with authorities acting quickly to rescue what we believe to be a sunken family.
The newscaster paused, and then, through a transition, disappeared. But what took her place was a camera on the scene. Within the frame were a variety of first responders, all standing at the edge of the water. Some jumped in to dive under the waving surface, while others connected a series of pulleys to whatever they could. A red glint, the backside of the car, rose just beyond the surface of the water, but not enough. No, not enough. The front was still completely under that bobbing surface.
I don't know what to tell you. They were just driving like any other car on the road, and then I look over, hear tires screech, and they're in the water. They're in the pond. I tried to run over there, but I couldn't do anything. I mean, what am I supposed to do? Just go into the water? It doesn't make any sense. It's not practical. I mean, the whole thing, just the whole vehicle just went in. There's no way they can get him out in time. It's too late. There's no way.
As witnesses spoke, their lips shakingly pursing at the cushion of the microphone, a faint mixture of beige and yellow glistened in the water behind them. Everyone else ignored it, frantically trying to rescue the drowners. But I saw it, even if they didn't. It was a doll, donning blonde hair, and a blue bow tucked into its scalp. Its soft fabric was invaded by water, wetting its sides and leaving shimmering droplets. I'd seen it before. Somewhere. The camera cut, moving over to a new frame. The reporter with the black hair returned, but her smile was absent.
The victims of that fatal accident have been identified as 32-year-old Paul Abellum and his 3 children, whose names are...
I changed the channel. Instead of the news report, the local golf tournament.